Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It's strange how a smile can lie louder than a scream, how a single photo can hide decades of bruises so well you almost believe the people in it liked each other. That day, under the filtered light of a suburban afternoon, with the grill sizzling and cheap white wine sweating on plastic tables, my family once again reminded me exactly where I stood. And I stood alone. Always had. The reunion was my father's idea, or maybe my mother's, doesn't really matter. They both liked performance more than substance. They wanted the illusion of a close family, the kind that sends holiday cards in matching sweaters and keeps long group texts alive with daily Bible quotes and emoji hearts. They didn't want the mess beneath the rug uncovered, and I'd spent most of my life either crawling under it or pretending it didn't exist. Until now. It had been 5 years since I last stood on that lawn. The same grass I used to mow as a teenager while Thomas sat in the garage learning how to give orders like he was already middle management. Even back then, I knew the power dynamic. He was the prince, I was the grunt. I thought maybe with time, age, and a little perspective, it would fade. Maybe we'd both mellow. We didn't. The second I stepped out of my rental, a quiet black sedan, nondescript, clean but not flashy, I felt their eyes scan me like TSA. Not what car is he driving, but why isn't he driving better? Why no wife? Why no visible success? My mother, Diane, smiled that brittle kind of smile she always gave when company came over, like she was biting a lemon, but pretending it was honey. "You made it," she said, holding out a limp arm that I awkwardly accepted. My father, Richard, gave a grunt that I suppose passed for a greeting, though he barely turned from the barbecue. He was wearing one of those polo shirts with a stitch name of a golf club he didn't belong to. Some things never change. Then came Thomas. Always last to show up, but first to be noticed. He arrived in a white Tesla, obnoxiously parked on the grass like it was his own red carpet. Wearing a tailored blazer over a Henley shirt, casual but intentional, the way rich guys dress when they want to act like money doesn't matter. "Michael," he said, that same tone he used as a kid when he called me names but didn't want to get caught. "Glad you could take a break from whatever it is you do." I smiled. Didn't say a word. Just nodded, like a dog being asked to sit for a treat. It didn't take long for the subtle jabs to turn sharp. The wine flowed, the stories got louder, and at some point Thomas launched into a story about his latest promotion, name-dropping a CEO I knew personally, and not in the way he thought. I stayed quiet, letting him perform. That's what this was for him. A stage. And we were all props. Then it happened. Right around dessert. He raised his glass, caught everyone's attention like a magician about to pull a rabbit, and said, "You know, Mick here was always the failure of the family. But hey, at least you've got a sense of humor about it." The laughter wasn't loud, but it was real. My parents chuckled. A cousin coughed into his napkin. Someone muttered, "That's just Thomas," like that excused anything. I looked at them, really looked. My mother, sipping Chardonnay like it was her four-drip. My father, checking his watch like he had a golf game to get to. And Thomas, grinning like he'd just won a bet he placed years ago. I could have stormed out. I could have flipped the damn table. But instead, I laughed. Just a light chuckle, the kind that floats above the surface like a dead leaf, harmless and dry. "You know what?" I said, standing slowly. "Let's take a group photo. It's been too long." They loved the idea. Photos meant legacy after all. My mother perked up, smoothing her blouse. My father mumbled something about getting his good side. Thomas put his arm around me like we'd been best friends since the womb. I insisted on using my phone. Better camera, I lied. I knew exactly what I was doing. I propped it on the table, hit the timer, walked back into the frame. We all smiled. Some smiles were drunk, some fake, some frozen from decades of practice. The shutter clicked. That's the image they'll all remember, or at least, the one they'll have to live with. Because that photo? That's the last time I played along. The last time I stood among them as the obedient, quiet disappointment they'd molded and dismissed. As they laughed and moved back toward the patio, I stood there for a second longer, looking at the photo on my screen. Blurry around the edges, overly bright, but you could see it. The truth. Right in the middle. I didn't delete it. I didn't share it. I saved it in a folder named Lasts. I knew then, this would be the last photo we ever took together. Smile, Mick. Just a little longer. It was the kind of summer heat that baked the back of your neck and made your shirt cling to your spine before you even stepped onto the field. I remember the taste of metal in my mouth as I gripped that battered aluminum bat, 10 years old and shaking like the thing weighed more than I did. The crowd, or rather, the row of disinterested parents and folding chairs, barely paid attention. Except for one man. My father, Richard, stood with arms folded and a scowl carved so deep into his face it looked permanent. He didn't shout, didn't cheer, didn't do much of anything but stare, like he was already disappointed and just waiting for me to prove him right. The pitch came fast, too fast for my scrawny arms and thin wrists, and I swung late. Air, again. Strike 3. That was it. Game over. I think the catcher gave me a pity pat on the back, but I can't be sure because the sound of my father's voice drowned out everything else. You embarrassed yourself, he said before I even stepped off the field. Jesus, Mick. You didn't even try. That was his favorite line growing up. You didn't even try. It didn't matter what it was, baseball, math tests, shoveling the damn driveway. If I failed, it meant I hadn't tried hard enough. But if Thomas succeeded, well, then he was simply brilliant, naturally gifted, the kind of boy you tell coworkers about. The same week I struck out of Little League, Thomas won a spelling bee at school. I say won in the loosest possible sense, because I saw the list of words the night before sitting on the kitchen counter, and then I saw Thomas whispering with Mom that morning, her lips barely moving as she repeated the hardest words. Mnemonic onomatopoeia, chrysanthemum. I remember because I learned them too, thinking maybe she'd quiz me next. She didn't. They printed out a certificate for Thomas. My mom laminated it. Dad framed it. It hung above the piano we never played, right next to that ridiculous caricature drawing from Disneyland, the one where Thomas looked like a cartoon superhero and I looked like a stunned ghost. I used to wonder what it was about me that made me invisible. I wasn't a bad kid. I didn't break things. I didn't scream or fight or steal. I just wasn't them. Not sharp enough for their world, not obedient enough to be their pet. But there was one person who saw me, even back then. Aunt Jean. She wasn't flashy or loud, didn't wear pearls or make remarks about stock options. She smoked too much and swore when she drank and told me stories that didn't end with lessons, but just ended. Real stories. Life stories. I think she saw what I was long before I did. Not a failure, not a genius, just a slow-burning fire that everyone assumed was smoke. When I struck out that day, while my father ranted and my mother silently set the table without looking at me, Jean slipped me a Snickers bar and said, "Better to strike out swinging than watch the damn ball go by." And for the first time that day, I didn't feel like crying. Years later, long after she passed and the rest of them pretended like she'd been the weird aunt you tolerate for holidays, I stood at her grave with a cup of cheap diner coffee and said thank you. Not just because she gave me a Snickers, but because she believed in me enough to write me a check when no one else would. It wasn't much, 10 grand maybe, though she claimed it was winnings from a blackjack trip to Reno. I later found out she sold her car. Said she preferred walking anyway. That money? It started my first real project. I flipped it into something huge. Now, I don't want to brag, but the return on that $10,000 check was over 80,000%, which is like, I don't know, $200,000 or something. Okay, math was never my strong suit, clearly. But the point is, that investment made me. Quietly. Anonymously. And none of them, not Thomas, not Richard, not Diane, ever knew where the money came from or where it went. I didn't buy Lamborghinis. I didn't splash my name across headlines. I learned to move in silence, like a wolf in loafers. By the time they thought to ask where I'd been, I was already 3 steps ahead and 2 continents away. They assumed I was drifting because that made it easier to explain why I wasn't sitting at their table. But the truth is, I wasn't drifting, I was building. One block at a time. One burned bridge at a time. Quiet revenge, the kind you plant and water and wait years to harvest. I visit Jean's grave every April. I bring a Snickers bar and a copy of my company's latest report, like a weird ritual only I understand. This year, I leaned against her headstone, looked up at the sky, and said, "Well, Jean, they still call me the failure." And then I laughed. Not loud, not bitter, just amused. Because now, I own the building Thomas works in, and the company his job depends on, and the data he's been presenting like it's his own. Yeah, that came from me. And yet, they still call me the failure. Cute. There's a particular pleasure in being underestimated, not the surface kind, not the smug smirk you give when someone thinks you can't do something and then you prove them wrong, but the deep kind, the one where they forget you exist altogether, where they write you off so completely that you become invisible, untouchable, untraceable. That kind of freedom is dangerous in the hands of someone with a grudge and a plan. I had both. And I had time. The empire I built didn't start with some grand dream of revenge. It started with necessity, with hunger, with silence so long it turned into steel. After Jean gave me that first check, 10 grand scraped from the bones of her own life, I used it like a wedge. I didn't go flashy. No apps. No crypto bullshit. I went infrastructure, the stuff nobody likes to talk about at parties, but everybody relies on. Back-end systems, data security, middleware, logistics platforms. The wiring behind the walls of modern life. It was ugly. It was boring. It was unshakable. I started with a name that wasn't mine. Just some guy, Caleb Strauss, nothing flashy, nothing traceable. Caleb became the signature on early deals, the face of shell companies that opened doors quietly. If you Googled him, you'd find enough to believe he was real, a LinkedIn, a few badly lit headshots, some fake articles quoting him on trends in automation. Nobody ever dug deeper. Why would they? Caleb was the face, but I was the hands. By the time the Caleb identity had cycled through 3 major acquisitions, I had a web of holding companies, investment vehicles, and digital fingerprints that looped so tightly nobody could see the center anymore. I didn't run my empire from a penthouse. I ran it from a 3rd-floor walk-up in Chicago, with blackout curtains and a refrigerator full of black coffee and takeout soy sauce packets. And from that little apartment, I watched the dominoes fall exactly how I placed them. I didn't just grow the empire. I directed it carefully, deliberately, like a conductor guiding a symphony where every note was a company and every pause was a buyout. And eventually, one of those companies, a logistics tech firm called Laug, acquired a small, floundering consulting group in Boston. That consulting group had just hired a new VP of strategy, Thomas. I swear to God, I didn't plan it at first. But when I saw the employee roster and his name sat there, bloated with entitlement and fancy titles, I couldn't help myself. I promoted the CEO of Laug, gave him a silent directive, expand his team, double budget allocations, fund bold internal pitches. And then I waited, like a fisherman watching the water ripple. Sure enough, Thomas pitched an idea, some half-baked optimization algorithm that looked impressive on a PowerPoint but barely held water under scrutiny. The CEO sent it up the ladder. It landed on my desk. I approved it. Not because it was good. It wasn't. But because I wanted to watch him sweat under the weight of his own mediocrity, to watch him stumble through execution while thinking he was a genius. I wanted him to believe he'd earned it, that his brilliance was finally being recognized. That was the sweetest part. Giving him everything he wanted and knowing it would never be enough. Meanwhile, Rebecca, my assistant, fixer, and arguably the most competent person I've ever worked with, stumbled on something interesting. A draft obituary. Not for me, of course, though it might as well have been. It was part of the estate documents Thomas had been compiling ever since my parents' health took that slow, steady nosedive. You know the kind, the quiet forgetting, the missing appointments, the whispered conversations about hospice behind closed doors. The draft was written like a press release, all glory and polished sadness, no soul. But what caught Rebecca's eye what made her call me at 2 in the morning was what wasn't in it. Me. Not even a footnote. No mention of a second son. No tribute, no acknowledgement. It was like I never existed. And not in the poetic, emotional way, but literally. I was gone from the record. They'd buried me before they were in the ground. I stared at that file for a long time, long after the screen dimmed and Rebecca went quiet on the other end of the line. I wasn't angry. Not in the way people imagine, no shouting, no slamming fists on desks. Just a low, slow burn in the back of my throat, the kind that tastes like smoke and memory. They'd erased me. Deliberately. And that's when I decided. Fine. If they want to bury me, let's start digging. It was a Tuesday morning when the call came, the kind of morning where everything feels normal until suddenly it doesn't, when the world shifts sideways and what used to matter feels irrelevant and what didn't matter yesterday becomes the only thing you can think about. I was pouring coffee, black, no sugar, standing in my kitchen barefoot, listening to the whir of the city outside my window, when Rebecca's name flashed on my phone. She never called before noon unless something burned, crashed, or bled. This time, it was all three. Car accident, she said, skipping hello, skipping soft landings. Highway 27. Rain, bad visibility, some idiot crossed the divider. They're gone. Both of them. At first, I didn't feel anything. Not anger, not grief, not even that hollow space people talk about when the ground drops out from under you. I just stood there, holding the phone with one hand and the coffee with the other, and nodded like she could see me through the line. And maybe it made me a monster, but the only thought in my head wasn't I'll miss them or how could this happen, but something simpler. So this is how it ends. I didn't cry. I didn't sit down or call anyone. Instead, I pulled open my laptop and typed in my last name. The obituary had already been submitted, fast, efficient, almost like Thomas had it ready to go. I scanned it slowly, line by line, half out of habit and half because I already knew what I wouldn't find. And there it was, in black and white, sitting bold under the headline, Richard and Diane Callahan, loving parents, community pillars. There was no mention of a second son. No nod to a surviving child named Michael. Just Thomas, referred to as their devoted son, their pride, and their legacy. I stared at the screen like maybe the letters would rearrange themselves, like maybe if I hit refresh enough times, I'd suddenly appear where I should have always been. But no, I was erased. Again. What Thomas didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the exact same morning, on newsstands across the country, another piece of writing hit paper. A glossy, full-color magazine with a name you've definitely heard and a headline you'd never expect. The invisible CEO who built America's quietest fortune. Beneath it, my face. No suit, no smile, just me, sunglasses, 5 o'clock shadow, staring dead into the lens like I already knew this day was coming. Rebecca made sure the timing was perfect. She'd pulled strings, made calls, moved publication dates. I didn't ask her to, not directly, but she knew what I was thinking before I even finished thinking it. She always did. And when that magazine hit mailboxes, coffee tables, boardrooms, and news feeds, my name exploded out of the shadows and straight into the spotlight I'd avoided for over a decade. It wasn't a vanity play. I didn't want fame, but I wanted something more potent. Recognition. Irrefutable proof that I wasn't just alive, I was thriving. That the man they'd cut out of the will, the son they'd cropped out of the photos and banished from the family tree, had outbuilt them, outlasted them, outsmarted them all. And on the same day they tried to bury my name, the world finally learned it. The calls started by noon. Some from old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, pretending to care, pretending they'd always believed in me. Others were more shameless ex-girlfriends, distant cousins, industry sharks who now realized they'd brushed shoulders with a ghost in boardrooms and never noticed. And then, inevitably, there was Thomas's boss. Or at least, the man who thought he was Thomas's boss. He left a message, cheerful, congratulatory, filled with carefully placed curiosity. Mick, had no idea you were involved in North Lyde. Small world, huh? Let's grab lunch soon, catch up. I didn't call back. I forwarded the message to Rebecca and told her to handle it. She replied with one line, "Already did. He knows now." As for the funeral, I went. Of course I did. Not because I needed closure or peace or any of that garbage people like to say to make death seem like less of a mess. I went because it was mine too. My burial. My final erasure. I wanted to see the faces that gathered without me, wanted to stand in the back and watch them carry 2 caskets into the ground while pretending there wasn't supposed to be a third. I wore black, naturally, and sunglasses that didn't come off even once. Not because I was crying, but because I didn't want to give them anything, not a flicker of sadness, not a sliver of regret. Thomas gave the eulogy. He was polished, composed, choked up in all the right places. He said words like legacy and sacrifice and unwavering love. People nodded, dabbed their eyes, clutched tissues they'd probably had ready the moment the obituary went live. I didn't step forward when they asked family to approach the caskets. I didn't linger at the graveside. I stood at the edge of the crowd, silent, unmoved, and when it was done, I turned and left before anyone realized I was there. Nobody saw me. And yet, somehow, everyone was looking. They still didn't see me. But now, they couldn't look away. Revenge, when it's done right, doesn't scream or rage or leave blood on the walls, it whispers. It moves with the silence of a chess master, one hand behind the back and the other pushing pieces that nobody notices until the king has nowhere left to go. That's how I planned it. Not with rage, not with heat, but with cold precision. Not because I'm a monster, but because after a lifetime of being erased, humiliated, and talked down to by people who couldn't see past their own vanity, silence was the only thing that ever made them listen. It started with a loophole, one of those buried details in legalese that most people skim over, but which I read like scripture. When my parents created the trust fund, back when Thomas was still learning to tie a tie and I was still being told to stop wasting time with computers, they named a local estate attorney as the executor, someone they believed was loyal, discreet, and moldable. What they didn't know was that he owed a few favors. And what nobody expected was that I would still be watching, still reading every damn document they ever filed, looking for my window. And I found it. The clause was simple, almost laughable in its oversight. The executor could transfer rights of execution, in part or in full, in the event of retirement or inability to maintain fiduciary responsibility. And with a little encouragement, and by encouragement, I mean a quiet offer to buy out a personal debt he owed from a messy divorce, he found himself unable to maintain anything at all. And just like that, I owned the execution rights to my parents' estate. Legally. Quietly. Irrevocably. It didn't matter that they left everything to Thomas. The way the trust was written, the executor held all the actual power over distribution. Thomas might have been the named beneficiary, but I now held the keys to the vault. And I turned them slowly, deliberately, while he slept like a prince believing the crown was already on his head. When the papers hit his desk, I can only imagine the color that drained from his face. The hours he must have spent with lawyers trying to figure out how it was possible. The fury boiling under that carefully managed hairline as he realized the assets were frozen, the funds inaccessible, the properties already sold off or reassigned to holding companies he didn't recognize. The name on the final transaction paperwork? Caleb Strass. Of course. I didn't expect the call, but it came. Midnight, which felt appropriate. I let it ring twice before answering. No greeting. What the hell did you do? Thomas's voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since we were teenagers, and I stole his baseball glove just to watch him lose it. Hey, I said calmly, remember the reunion? I do. Silence. I told you to smile, I added. Last photo and all. You son of a bitch, he hissed, and then some garbled shouting, something about betrayal and theft and justice. I didn't interrupt. I let him scream into the receiver, the way he used to yell at me across dinner tables while our parents pretended not to hear. And when he finally stopped to breathe, I said the one thing I knew would cut deepest. They left me out of the obituary, Tom. Think about that. Think about how hard they had to work to pretend I never existed. And I hung up. I didn't hear from him again. A week later, I stood in front of the house we grew up in. Empty now, listed quietly on the market, stripped of everything sentimental and staged with generic furniture to lure some poor young couple who'd never know the ghosts that lingered in the corners. I let myself in with the master key the lawyer had forgotten to collect, walked through each room like I was sleepwalking, trailing fingertips across walls that once heard shouting and sobbing and silence. The kitchen looked smaller, the hallway thinner. The backyard, where I once struck out with a wiffle bat and felt the weight of my father's disappointment press like a boot on my chest, now just weeds and dry patches of earth. The house didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a crime scene after the chalk lines have faded. I found the last family photo in a drawer, shoved between water bills and expired coupons. The one I'd taken years ago, where we were all smiling but not one of us meant it. I held it for a long time, staring at the cracks in the print, the forced closeness of our bodies, the way I stood just off-center, like even then I didn't quite belong. I didn't say anything as I dropped it in the sink, lit a match and let it burn. No dramatic speeches, no cinematic music in my head. Just the soft sound of old paper turning to ash. It didn't feel like closure. It didn't feel like justice. It just felt done. Back in my apartment, I stood in front of the mirror, older than I ever expected to feel, richer than I ever expected to be, and lonelier than I had ever imagined. I looked at myself, really looked for the first time in years. And I said out loud, not for anyone else but for me, so, who's the failure now? And then I sighed. The kind of sigh that doesn't release anything, just makes the silence heavier. I had one. I had checkmated every single person who tried to bury me, sideline me, laugh at me. I had taken their legacy and rewrote it in my name, carved it into stone with ink and contracts, and the kind of quiet ruthlessness that doesn't make headlines, just enemies. I got everything I wanted. And not a damn thing I needed.